Well, good morning. So first of all, I'd like to thank Donna Qualters for that kind introduction and for the invitation. And I'd like to commend Tufts University for taking the leadership in putting together this conference and moving forward in this important area of inclusive excellence in teaching and learning. I'm glad to see that Tufts is ahead of its time and promoting this not just for Tufts University, but the broader community. So what I'd like to do for you today in the time that I have with you is to examine some of the social frameworks, some of those social factors and dynamics that influence the ways of doing and knowing, and how we define and carry out inclusive teaching and learning. I'm going to talk to you from my own lived experiences, and I'm also going to share with you some of what I think we can learn from the literature about inclusive excellence and how we apply that in teaching and learning. I'm going to give you a few definitions, some contextual frameworks, and some core strategies. And then I'd like us to end with some interactive discussion. So I want to start by telling you an early experience that I had around teaching and learning, that on reflection, I know now that it actually has a lot to do with some of the concepts that we're going to talk about today. But I'm going to tell you about an experience that I had. It was the summer after 8th grade, and I was a volunteer in a community center, and my goal was to teach and tutor students around reading. And there was one student in particular, an African-American male student, who really touched me, and I spent most of the summer with him. He was in the 2nd grade, and he was told he was going to be kept back because he was not reading at grade level. So I spent the entire time working with him. Lovely young man. I found him to be bright and eager. He absorbed materials like a sponge. And I couldn't understand why on earth this kid had been threatened with being kept back for not being able to read. So as we were working together over the summer, I saw that he actually could read. He was a great reader. And of course, there were these standardized tests that we were using. By the end of the summer, he was reading above grade level. And I was happy to report to his family that he was, after speaking with his teacher, he was not going to be kept back. But then I thought about it. Again, this is on reflection. What skills did I have as a teenager that really could have pulled out this untapped talent in this child? And what I realized during the time, I actually was operating from instincts and some of my own personal values. What I saw was a student who was quite capable, and there was no reason why he couldn't be proficient in reading. What I was drawing on in terms of personal values is that it was very important to me that all students would have an opportunity to learn. And I realized there were some things from my parents that really stuck in, really hit home for me. So I grew up in a military family. I was one of 5. And my parents there were certain inalienable truths in our house. And one of them was education is important, education is power. And while they were teaching us how to navigate society, how to be able to deal with inequities that they knew would come to us as African American children, they were very clear about there's one thing that no one can take from you. That's your knowledge. That's your education. Your job right now as a kid is to get educated. That's your job. That's your full-time job. And that really stood with me. But another thing amongst these truths that were just, again, inalienable in our house was that you would share and you would give back to those who were less fortunate than you. It's just a given. We learned that if you had a bag of candy, don't you open it up unless you're willing to share with all your siblings. So it was that deep sense of sharing and caring and giving back to those who are less fortunate. That was very important to me growing up. And I think that had a lot to do with why I was successful with this particular student. And I thought about even that year, I said I grew up in a military family. I was born in Anchorage, Alaska. We moved all around the country. But when I was in the 8th grade, my father was near retirement. He moved the family to New Orleans, which is where we were from. And my 8th grade education was in a public school in New Orleans. It was still mixed at the time. It hadn't completely gone to be almost all underrepresented minorities. But I realized in that year, I could also identify with the student that I was working with that summer, because in the class that I had, the courses that I undertook in the school that I was in, I noticed that the underrepresented minority students were absolutely not given the same kind of care and attention as the majority students from those who were tasked with the responsibility of teaching. So again, those formative experiences and the things that I learned a bit about teaching and learning, I'll share with you a little bit more of the kinds of things that I've now learned from the social sciences that helped inform that and explain that type of experience. So now I want to share with you a few definitions so that we'll all be on the same page and have some shared backgrounds to understand the rest of the talk and as we move forward. So we speak about diversity and inclusion. I'm sharing here some definitions that are very typical. There are many definitions out there. This is a typical definition. This one's from the Association of American Medical Colleges, and they've used this in 2011. So diversity speaks to the richness of human difference, encompasses socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, language, nationality, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, geography, disability, age, and individual aspects such as personality, learning styles, and life experiences. Then we're going to talk about inclusion, a core element for successfully achieving and sustaining diversity. It refers to active, intentional, and ongoing engagement with diversity and is achieved through creating an institutional culture that fosters belonging, respect, and value for all. Diversity and inclusion. Recently, there's been a move to have another term used to speak to diversity inclusion. Diversity inclusion denoting a characteristic where an institution demonstrates through its policies and practices that diversity is central to its mission. And we know that if we have diversity and inclusion, or the newer term diversity inclusion, that's going to promote inclusive excellence. And you can't have inclusive excellence if we don't have diversity and inclusion. And that promotes innovation, creativity, and enhanced performance and productivity. Harvard Medical School has been very active in promoting the use of the term diversity and inclusion. They've also noted in some of the work that they've been doing that, of course, there's some barriers to diversity and inclusion. And at the individual level, we look at things like resilience and preparation, opportunity, and resources. At the societal level, policies, politics, economics, the environment. And the role that an environment plays can't be underestimated. Organizationally, we look at culture, policies, and practices. Now I want to share with you a definition of inclusive excellence taken from Salazar, Stone, Norton, and Tuitt, where we look at the purposeful embodiment of inclusive practices toward multiple student identity groups. And another concept I'd like us to think about as we're thinking about inclusive teaching and learning and inclusive excellence in that arena is cultural competence. The ability to work effectively across cultures in a way that acknowledges and respects the culture of the person or the organization being served. And of course, there are elements of cultural competence that are important to us. We think about it as a set of congruent attitudes, practices, policies, and structures that respects and supports the culture and values of culturally distinct groups, awareness of one's own cultural identity, and understanding within group and between group differences. These are all worth taking note of because there are many concepts that they may be in the back of our minds, but we don't really consciously think about them and talk about them. And I want to talk about a few presumptions that are attached to culture. And I borrowed this from Chris Cullinan, who's a national consultant who speaks to diversity in organizations, as well as cultural competence. And in some of her workshops, she specifically talks about some of the presumptions that are attached to culture. And I like to highlight a couple in particular that relate to teaching and learning. The presumption of worthiness and the presumption of unworthiness. So in the dominant culture, it's typically assumed that those in the dominant culture, they're worthy of the education. There's a presumption of competence for the dominant culture. That doesn't necessarily translate to those who are non-dominant cultures. And if we are responsible for teaching and learning, and even if it's subconscious, that some are immediately looked at as worthy and competent and some are not, we're going to have a problem in how we educate for the future. Now I want to share with you some contextual frameworks that I think are very important. And I'm going to say context matters. I'll say that again, context matters. And when we look at how we educate, when we look at how we evaluate, when we look at how we determine educational outcomes, it's very important to consider the context, the environments under which the activity is taking place. So I have a number of conceptual frameworks I think we should think about. These are things that, from my own lens as an African-American female faculty member and administrator in the academy, these are things that I've looked at in the social sciences that speak to me, that I think may be interesting to those of you who are looking at these areas as well. So one framework I'd like to share with you is optimal distinctiveness theory, a term that's been coined, and Professor Brewster has been credited with this. But optimal distinctiveness theory posits that there's distinct and opposing drives for individual differentiation and group belonging. And this optimal distinctiveness theory-based inclusion, talked about in another article, says it allows an individual to hold insider status in a group while retaining their uniqueness, and enables inclusiveness climate, inclusive leadership, and inclusiveness practice. So here's why it's important to think about optimal distinctiveness theory. By human nature, we have this tension. We want to belong. We all want to belong. It's very important to have a sense of belonging. But at the same time, we want to be unique, and we want to be recognized as individuals, and we want to operate in a world that our individual characteristics are recognized as well. So how do you balance that tension, belonging and being individual and being unique and true to yourself? It's a tension that we all live with. It helps explain in-group and out-group dynamics. It helps explain collaborations. It helps explain how we work together in teams, and it does influence some of the work that we do around teaching and learning. I'd like to share another concept with you. Individuality. Again, we all want to be seen as individuals, but we want to belong as well. So according to mathematician Peter Molinar, who used his mathematical insights towards social dynamics, he's saying an individual is a high-dimensional system evolving over place and time. And he talked about 3 principles of individuality: jaggedness. Human qualities such as intelligence and character are multidimensional, so there's no one dimension to any of us. Context, performance and behavior, and it's situational, and things, as I was saying, activities and so on, varies within the context that they're happening. And pathways, so individuals progress along unique pathways. So again, let's keep in mind that concept of individuality. And then Todd Rose, I'd like to take a quote from Todd, says, human beings don't line up perfectly. There's no average learner. They have strengths and weaknesses. They all do. Even geniuses do. So this idea that we don't necessarily just standardize or teach to the middle or think that everyone can be described by some standardized test or reduce people to a number based on a score that they made on an exam. Let's look at the individual, and let's look at all dimensions of the individual. Another concept that I think is very important as we think about teaching and learning: identity formation. There's a lot of literature around how we form professional identities, how we form a science identity, and so on. But I'm thinking about identity. We all have multiple identities. Identities are informed by race, gender, culture, a number of different factors, but it's a self-concept. It is constructed socially and contextually. So we can't have an identity outside of the context that we find ourselves in. Again, we have multiple identities. It's developed temporally. And you'll see, if you think about it, if you reflect on your own careers and experiences, you'll see that there are parts of your identity that were there at the very beginning, and it evolves and it can be reinforced over time. But there's also things that happen in our environments that can disrupt that identity. Again, identity is influenced by a sense of belonging, everyday practices and interactions, and the intersections between culture, time, and environment. I'm going to share with you a little bit of work that I have done some research in my own area around science identity formation. So this published study, Narrations of Race in STEM Research Settings, Identity Formation and Its Discontents. This was a study that I worked on with a colleague, Corrine Malone, who's at the University of West Georgia. And we did this work while I was at Georgia Tech. What we were doing, we were looking at how do women of color in particular form a science identity in research settings. And what we did was we had a number of interviews with women who were in engineering and computer science. They were all women of color, all different disciplines. We also had focus groups, and we spoke to them specifically about their experiences in their labs and in the classrooms, and these were all graduate students. They were all working towards Ph.D.s. And what we found is that there are things about being solo or one of a few in a particular environment that actually informs the way one is able to see oneself as a scientist or engineer. We looked at how identity is produced at the cusp of social and the individual, and again, contextual, temporal. And one of the things that I found that was very interesting, when we started the study, the majority of the women who were in the group with us had all said that they wanted to be faculty members when they obtained their PhDs. They all talked about why they wanted to get the PhD and go into academics in the first place. They wanted to give back. They wanted to give back to their communities. They talked about having support networks. Many times it was within their communities. Sometimes it was family, sometimes it was church, and so on. But they all also talked about feeling outside of their research laboratories, being disconnected and not feeling that sense of belonging. And by the time we ended this study, it was a year-long study, I was so disappointed. Not one of those women said they still wanted to be in academics. And the reason they were citing was the experience that they had had going towards their PhDs. Some were, of course, still working on the PhDs. But what they were saying was that there was something about the environment that was not encouraging to them, did not tell them that they belonged and that they could see themselves and identify with the profession as academicians. So there's something very powerful about the experiences, and there's much that we can do as faculty members that can help with encouraging students to see themselves that way. I was also informed by another study. This is in the literature by Carloni and Johnson. Turns out their study was specifically around science identity formation, and they too looked at a group of women of color as their study group. And here's what I thought was very interesting in what they found. They talked about in their model 3 intersecting dimensions of science identity formation: performance and competence and recognition. And when they looked at what has the most influence of one's ability to form the science identity, what they found was recognition was the most important, saying that You could be competent and you could perform well. But if the recognition, particularly from the recognized others who are in the field and discipline, does not come, identity is disrupted. So this concept of recognition being important, this concept of the dimensions of identity formation is really important. And I want to bring that back to academic experiences and academic success. So we know that persistence in the academic career, or in academics in terms of just going through your educational experience, is associated with an ability to identify. And we know that in terms of recognition, if there's positive recognition, it's going to reinforce identity. If it's negative recognition, it can counteract that. We know that role models are important. So the data that was just shared with you about the representation of underrepresented minority faculty on campus, not just at Tufts, but across the country, is really important. There is a link to increasing the numbers of underrepresented students and the numbers of underrepresented faculty in our universities and colleges. And we know that, again, identity does begin early on. It can evolve over time, and it's in response to experiences and how we internalize those experiences. It's relational and it's interactionist by nature. So the quality of interactions between peer-to-peer, student to faculty, faculty to faculty are very important, and it does impact one's confidence in their abilities. So I've shared with you some theories and also some models from others. Now I'm going to share with you my own model. This is something that I've come to, again, on reflection, looking back on my own career, and I'm looking at what I consider interrelated, longitudinal, and multi-level factors, so that at the individual level, at the institutional and the social level, and at policy levels, they all work together along with what happens over the course of a career to impact someone's ability to progress in that career. So there are things, again, at the individual level that could be important. So if you're in solo status, that's important. How well you interact with individuals and how you handle that is important. Your identity based on race and gender makes a difference at the individual level. At the institutional level, we do need to take responsibility for the climate and what we consider for some, particularly if they're underrepresented and underserved, as a chilly climate. And at the policy level, there really are policies and practices that are put in place that actually contribute to the differential experience of people based on their backgrounds. Maybe race and ethnicity are examples. So now I'm going to give you a bit of history from my own experience that illustrates the model that I'm talking about. When I was in preschool age, the city that we lived in, we were in Dover, Delaware, when I was at this age that you would go to kindergarten, but there was no kindergarten available for me to go to. So I did not have that experience. So my first experience was going to first grade elementary school. And I was one of the most excited kids about first grade. I really loved from the very beginning learning. I would grab every book I could read. I was fortunate that my mother had gotten me a library card as a preschooler, and I just loved learning. So imagine my excitement. First day of class, first grade, Dover, Delaware. And one of the formative memories that I have is that the teacher of the class, she asked everyone to say where they were born. And again, I mentioned to you I was part of a military family. So I proudly said I was born in Anchorage, Alaska. And everybody else in the class, I must also say I was the only African American in the class. And everyone else was born in Dover, Delaware. And they were all born in the same hospital. So the teacher said to me in the class, like, you weren't born in Anchorage, Alaska. Like, why would you lie to the class? And I remember thinking, right, why would I lie? I'm 6 years old. What do I know about Anchorage, Alaska? Like, why? And if I was going to pick a city to make up, why would I pick that one? You know? So that was very formative to me. And, you know, I'm pretty old now, and I'm still telling that story. I remember distinctly being told that by a teacher. So when I was in third grade, we typically went to school on military bases, which were integrated. We were in Panama City, Florida, and the base housing wasn't available to us yet, so we couldn't go to the base school. So we were going to school out in town. And where we were living, there was a white elementary school that was walking distance from our house, but we were black, so we couldn't go there. We had to be bused to a school that was in a rural area that was still when the residual of separate but equal. This school was anything but equal. The classroom was dilapidated, the building was dilapidated. We were using old textbooks that had been retired from other schools. Again, a formative experience for me. And I was a third grader, and I remember there were times that the teacher said, I was one of the ones that they would look at as teacher's pet. She's like, "You're smart. I need to take a break. Handle the class." And, you know, part of me was like, "Oh, this is great. I'm handling the class as a third grader." But the other part of me, even at that age, I'm like, "I don't think you should be leaving me in charge of the class." So the idea of the influences that faculty and teachers can have on a kid's career is very important. So now let's move forward a bit. It's in high school. Now we are, again, in New Orleans. My dad had moved the family there. I'm at a college prep school, and I was the only one of 4 students of color at my grade level. This was the 11th grade. I was the only woman of color in my chemistry class, and there were only a few women in the class. And the chemistry teacher made it very clear to the women in the class that he did not expect women to do well in chemistry, so carry on, have your conversations in the back of the room. It was really seriously clear that women weren't expected to do well in chemistry. But I actually went on to excel in and major in chemistry in college. But again, those kind of messages that we send to our students. So I finished chemistry. I entered Rice University in chemical engineering. I was the first African American ever admitted to the graduate program in chemical engineering at Rice. What stood out to me, and I'm going to tie this back into some of the things that we're talking about here today, what stood out to me is how many faculty members went out of their way to tell me that you're not like the rest. I'm like, actually, I can see that. Your background is different. And I thought, oh, chemistry? But I actually, I knew that they maybe meant something more than just chemistry. But what stood out to me was the message that I was told. They weren't expecting me to succeed. They were not expecting me to succeed. And I'm going to go back to the example that I gave you that the young student that I helped. I think that part of why he did so well, one, he just had the talent. It was just there, it was untapped. But I had high expectations for him, and I told him so. Every day we had goals that he was expected to accomplish, and every day he accomplished those goals. So the power of having high expectations really does make a difference. And when I moved on from my Ph.D., I started my academic career at Northeastern here in Boston in chemical engineering. And I remember the first day of class, my class was Chemical Engineering, Kinetics, and Reactors Design, Chemical Engineering 1421. And I was a brand new faculty member, shaking in my boots, and I got to class early. I wanted to make sure to do well. I go to the classroom, I put my name on the board, I've got my book, I've got my notes, I'm ready. And I noticed that the students, the few who were coming in, this was early morning, it was like an 8 o'clock class, and the students would come in and they'd peek in the room and they'd step back out in the hall. And so I thought people were just trickling in there because it's so early in the morning. But then now it's like 8:15 and there's now a crowd of students out in the hallway. So now I'm getting nervous. And I'm thinking, what is that rule? I remember when I was a student, faculty member not there in 15 minutes, right? You leave. So I go out in the hall. It's like, I don't want to be reported as the first day of class that I was missing in action. So I say to the students, are you here for chemical engineering 1421? They said, yes, but the teacher's not there. And these were all students that had come in, taken a peek. So I said, come in, I'm the instructor. And they're, oh, you? So again, these kinds of messages, these are societal messages, and you would think, it was many years ago, I started at Northeastern in 1989, but I can tell you that from my lived experience again, and from what I see as a faculty member and as administrator, when I talk to students and when I talk to faculty, these things still happen. We're still operating in an environment that our students have differential experiences based on their backgrounds, identities, cultures, and so on. I want to share with you a couple more things before I end. Contextualize cultural competence. And if we're really truly culturally competent in our organizations, it's when we have a defined set of values and principles, and we demonstrate behaviors, attitudes, policies, and structures that enable them to work effectively cross-culturally. We have the capacity to value diversity, conduct self-assessment, manage dynamics of difference, acquire and institutionalize cultural knowledge, adapt to diversity and cultural context of the communities that we're serving. And if you incorporate all these aspects in policy making, administration, practice, service delivery, and involve systematically consumers, key stakeholders, and communities, that's when we can say we've done a good job with cultural competence. And I'm going to leave you with another study that I looked at recently. And this is a 2016 study. It was reported in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. This is a study on the relationship between implicit racial bias and performance. These investigators looked at in-learning interactions, so they were simulated interactions, but they were in-learning interactions with white instructors and black or white learners. And what they found was that implicit bias actually did predict test performance. So, quoting from their study, they saw that the instructors' implicit racial bias affected lesson quality and predicted students' performance. So when the expectation was lower and when the preparation of the lesson was a bit different, there was a correlation where they saw that the black students in particular did not perform as well. So their findings from their study suggest that underperformance by minorities in academic domains may be influenced by the effect implicit racial biases have on educators' pedagogical effectiveness. Now, one thing we can take from this, there's plenty that we can do that can counteract these kinds of behaviors. It also says, note what they said, implicit racial bias. This is unintended. This is not conscious racial bias. This is implicit racial bias. It also says that it doesn't matter if it's intended or not. There are still consequences that can be negative towards the learners. And finally, back to the original concept here, this reframing excellence. Here's some things I want us to think about as we move forward with inclusive excellence through teaching and learning. Let's think about that sense of belonging. We are all guided by principles of human nature. We all want to have a sense of belonging. And it's been shown over and over again that students do better when they connect. Faculty do better when they connect. That's why we have things like communities of practice and learning communities. It's been shown that freshman students, for example, in that first year, if they can connect some way, they tend to do better and are more likely to be retained if there's some sort of connection within the first 6 weeks of their arriving on campus. We talked about individuality, gave you a sense of the concept of identity formation, cannot underestimate the importance of expectations. People rise to expectations. And I'm sure most of you have heard of and are familiar with this concept of stereotype threat. Professor Steele at Stanford has been a very big proponent of moving that forward, that communities and individuals, if you identify with a particular stereotype that says you're not likely to perform as well related to that stereotype, that's lack of performance is likely to come true. And that stereotype threat has been shown over and over again in many different settings. And accountability. So I like to say that we are all responsible for inclusive excellence, for inclusive excellence that relates to excellence in teaching and learning. And I'm not just talking about the faculty and the administrators, I'm also talking about the learners. I think it's a two-way street, and we all share that responsibility to make sure that we provide the kind of inclusive environment so that everyone can be successful and not only survive but thrive. We cannot afford to leave any untapped talent on the table. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your indulgence, and I'd be happy to take any questions, and more importantly, if there are comments that you all would like to share with each other as well.